Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate everyone's conversation here. Typically, when we're having a subcommittee on a particular bill, we're talking about the merits of the language in the bill. We're trying to either decide whether we're accepting the language as is, rejecting it altogether, or we're perfecting it. We didn't have that discussion today necessarily. There was a few pieces. I think there's things in here that, we could talk about how we were, to address some of the concerns as far as making sure that the right person is being executed, make sure the person is mentally competent, making sure that we're protecting the conscience of the executor or the person that would be asked to carry out the execution. Those things are addressed in the bill. We didn't talk about that, and that's fine. We had more of a philosophical discussion today on whether or not we should reinstate the death penalty, capital punishment. And I am heartened, actually, that we're having this discussion in the context of the sanctity of life, because I think that conversation should carry on beyond just this issue about the preciousness of life, because we have other issues and bills that we deal with specifically dealing with the preciousness and the sanctity of human life. And so I would like to see that standard be carried on throughout all of the policy that we consider. And I think that this is also a discussion that we should continue on in the public square, in our places of worship, around the dinner table. We should talk about these things, about these statistics that we've heard, about whether it's a true deterrent, whether or not, or whether it is revenge or whether it is justice. I think we should have those discussions. We should continue having that discussion moving forward. I'm glad that we're able to do this civilly and with decorum. I'm going to give you some of my perspective here because, and I'll try to keep it brief, Mr. Chair, because I know that we have an interest of time here. Government's primary role is to protect the rights of its citizens, and in the event that those rights are violated, government's role is to carry out just punishment, and as much as is humanly possible, to make the victim whole again, and to compel the perpetrator to assist in making that victim whole again. Now, obviously, when someone's life is taken, you can't make them whole again. I mean, we can't resurrect someone from the dead. So then we're just pretty much left with what is the proper administration of justice in those situations. I believe, and I think that it has been pointed out by several pastors who have been here today, that government has been given not only the power of the purse, but also the power of the sword to administer justice and to facilitate the restoration of victims, as much as humanly possible. So as we're considering this bill, and I think another question that was made here that was put to us, that the belief that it's permissible, but is it prudent? That's a good question for us to consider today. And as much as I would like to take time and talk about individual things that have been brought forward, I'm going to resist that temptation, and I want to leave you all with a thought regarding the practicality of reinstating the death penalty. I want to tell you a story. Back in 2001, there was a man by the name of Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, who was arrested as a suspect in the grisly killings of several young women that he had also sexually assaulted. Ridgway had committed these murders over several years throughout the 1980s and 90s, and then disposed of his victims' bodies along a 65-mile stretch of the Green River in King County, Washington. Thankfully, through advances in DNA testing, law enforcement was able to link Ridgway with some of his victims. However, he was suspected of so many more than what could readily be linked. In an effort to help find the bodies, when they did eventually arrest Mr. Ridgway, in an effort to help find the bodies of Ridgway's other victims, and in order to help bring closure to the families to those victims, the prosecutor promised to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for Ridgway's confession and assistance in finding the bodies of his other victims. Ridgway agreed and confessed to dozens more crimes, and today he is currently serving 49 consecutive life sentences in the Washington State Penitentiary. While I think that some here would like to see a different outcome and be seen that Mr. Ridgway's life be forfeit, I am at least satisfied knowing that the families of those many victims have at least some semblance of closure in the loss of their loved ones. In this instance, the death penalty wasn't even utilized. But I'm convinced that this outcome would not have been realized if the state of Washington did not have the death penalty. And so I think that's something for us to consider as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So this bill has been an interesting journey for me, in a way. Conceptually and morally, I believe the death penalty for certain horrific crimes is absolutely appropriate, such as the ones that were just detailed by Representative Hartzell. Yet practically, I arrived at a different conclusion than I expected. I have always believed that life in prison costs taxpayers so much more money, yet I found out in researching this legislation that in fact it costs more to have someone on death row. I have always believed that the death penalty was a deterrent, and while I still believe in some situations that might be the case, or at least useful in the case that Representative Hartzell spoke about, in general, based on the data, the death penalty is not a successful deterrent. It is also true that the infrastructure necessary to reinstate the death penalty would be very costly. I think the county attorneys alluded to that. I'm also struck as I did my research just how many individuals are wrongfully convicted in our country. And as a result of DNA evidence, we're seeing that more and more today. And it really strikes me deep at the thought of executing someone who is innocent. Finally, and most difficult for me from a moral perspective, is how to administer the death penalty fairly. Statistics show, without a doubt, that those of lesser means are more likely to receive the death penalty than are those with greater assets and ability to hire the best attorneys. So my conclusion after researching this bill was not exactly what I expected. I support the death penalty in theory and believe it is absolutely morally okay based upon my faith. But I have great issues with its practical and prudent and fair application. So this is what will now take place. I will advance the bill to full committee for additional consideration, but I do so with grave reservations as to its practical and fair application, and I will certainly express that to my fellow committee members. I truly appreciate your time today and for sharing your strong convictions. God bless you. This committee is adjourned.